Why the empath's awakening is the narcissist's worst fear. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. This truth lies at the heart of today's message. Welcome to Spiritual Wisdom, where we dive deep into the soul's awakening. In this video, we explore why the empath's awakening is the narcissist's worst fear, and how reclaiming your emotional power is the beginning of a profound transformation. If you've ever felt like your sensitivity was a weakness, think again. It might just be your greatest strength. Are you ready to stop absorbing pain and start reflecting the truth? If this speaks to your journey, comment below. I am awakening to my true self. Let's grow together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more soul-shifting wisdom. 1. Empathy was born from trauma, not choice. Empathy was not a gift handed out in peace. It was a weapon forged in chaos. The empath did not emerge from praise or protection, but from emotional minefields where the only safety came from feeling everything before it exploded. He learned to scan every room, decode every sigh, and carry burdens that weren't his, all in the name of love that felt conditional, fleeting, or entirely absent. That sensitivity people now praise, it began as a shield. It began as a way to survive a childhood where reading the mood meant avoiding pain. That soul, his soul, was not fragile, it was alert, alive, wired for survival. He became attuned, not out of desire, but out of necessity. And so, the gifts of compassion, intuition, and insight were not traits of privilege, but the visible remains of invisible wounds. People-pleasing wasn't his nature, it was his armor. In a world where conflict led to rejection, he chose silence. In a home where vulnerability was a trap, he chose performance. The empath, especially the male empath, learned to abandon parts of himself to be chosen by others. And the tragedy is, he was never truly chosen, only used, tolerated, or depended upon. He played the peacemaker, the fixer, the emotional sponge. But deep down, the soul kept record. And one day, that soul awakens not loudly, but with undeniable clarity. It stops asking for approval, stops chasing apologies, stops kneeling at the altar of false peace. This awakening is not a rebellion. It is a return to self-respect, a return to emotional integrity, a return to the parts of him that were buried under years of self-sacrifice. And that return terrifies the narcissist, because the empath no longer dances to the rhythm of their chaos. He no longer absorbs their projections, no longer flinches at their silence, no longer explains himself to soothe their discomfort. Instead, he mirrors. He holds up truth like a blade, not to hurt, but to reveal. He no longer pleads. He watches. He no longer fixes. He releases. And in this release, he becomes dangerous, not because he seeks revenge, but because he has nothing left to lose. The power dynamic collapses because it was always held up by his silence, his guilt, his willingness to bend. Now, he stands. Now, he speaks. Now, he sees. And in that clarity, the narcissist sees their worst fear, a soul they can no longer control. He is not angry. He is awake. He is not cruel. He is clean. The soul that once sought peace at any price now refuses to pay for what should have been free respect, honesty, reciprocity. This man, this empath, is not soft. He is sovereign, and sovereignty is spiritual armor. He has grieved the lost years, mourned the false love, and now walks not with bitterness, but with boundaries. His empathy still lives, but it is no longer a currency others can spend. It is a compass, pointing inward first. That is why the narcissist fears him. Not because he changed, but because he remembered who he was before he was told to forget. And that kind of soul, once awakened, cannot be manipulated, broken, or made small again. If you've ever realized that your empathy was shaped by survival, not by choice, share your story in the comments below. It might help someone feel less alone. And if this is a new insight for you, comment, "I'm beginning to understand," so we can heal and grow together. 2. The awakening begins with inner conflict and rage. When an empath stops pleasing others, what rises first is not peace, but sacred rage, a deep, soul-igniting fire that shakes everything they thought they were. It's the echo of years spent betraying their own truth to maintain fragile harmony, the grief of realizing they were never truly seen, only used, tolerated, or idealized for their ability to feel deeply. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And for the empath, this pain becomes the catalyst for awakening. That anger, raw, unexpected, and unfamiliar, is not a flaw. It is the soul reclaiming its rightful space. It is the collapse of the false self, the one that bowed to expectations and sacrificed authenticity for belonging. The empath was conditioned to feel the room before feeling themselves, to anticipate others' moods, to abandon their own boundaries in exchange for temporary safety. This survival tactic, taught in childhood, eventually becomes a prison in adulthood, especially in relationships with narcissists, those who feed off the light but offer no warmth in return. For years, the empath confuses being useful with being loved. They perform, give, and forgive until there's nothing left of their original self. But something sacred breaks open when the soul can no longer tolerate the lie. One day, without fanfare, the empath stops explaining their feelings. They stop absorbing guilt that was never theirs. They stop negotiating with manipulation. And in that quiet refusal, they become terrifying not because they're dangerous, but because they're free. A narcissist's greatest fear is not rejection, it's irrelevance. And when the empath no longer needs validation, the game ends. The mirror shatters. The emotional supply vanishes. The control dissolves. The empath, once so easily influenced, now sees clearly. They are no longer here to heal what didn't want to be healed. They are no longer available for the emotional chaos they didn't create. Take Sarah, for example, a woman who gave her entire being to a marriage that demanded her silence and praised her sacrifice. For over a decade, she became invisible in her own life, putting everyone first while quietly dying inside. But one morning, something ancient and undeniable moved in her. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked at herself and whispered, "No more." That whisper was the voice of her soul. She walked away, not in hatred, but in clarity. She reclaimed her name, her voice, her vision. And the man who once fed on her empathy, he panicked. Not because she attacked him, but because she no longer needed him. She no longer played the role. The narcissist had lost the stage, and with it, his power. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that is what Sarah did. That is what every empath does when they stop betraying themselves to preserve someone else's illusion. This journey is messy. It hurts. It confuses me. But every tear is the truth leaving the body. Every outburst is the psyche breaking chains. Every boundary is a declaration of self-worth. The empath doesn't become cold. they become sovereign. They don't become heartless, they become discerning. They don't seek revenge, they seek freedom. And the soul, once fragmented, begins to unify. This is not just healing, it is transformation. It is the beginning of living in alignment with the truth that was buried under the need to be loved. So when the rage comes, honor it. When the grief floods you, let it cleanse. When clarity dawns, don't run. Because your awakening is not your destruction, it is your return. And that return is what the narcissist never saw coming. Comment below. I am reclaiming my truth. If you're ready to honor the sacred rage and rise into your true self. And if this message resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom and turn on the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. 3. The shadow and the wild self must be reclaimed. The empath's spiritual awakening doesn't begin in light. It begins in fire. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of memory. It begins the moment they turn inward and face the shadow they've been taught to fear. Their unmet needs, their unspoken anger, their buried desires, and the parts of themselves they silenced just to keep the peace. That shadow is not evil. It is the truth. As Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The empath was never meant to live only as a healer or a giver. They were meant to be whole. But wholeness demands that they reclaim their wild self, the primal, intuitive, unapologetic force inside that never asked for permission to exist. This wild self doesn't negotiate with manipulation. It doesn't shrink for approval. It is not interested in being polite if politeness means betrayal of the soul. And so, the empath begins to say no, not out of cruelty, but out of sacred clarity. They stop explaining themselves to those who never tried to understand them. They stop absorbing pain and start reflecting truth. The boundaries they feared would push people away become the exact lines that draw their true power back. Their anger, once demonized, becomes holy, and it tells them where injustice lives. Their needs, once labeled selfish, become sacred. They tell them what kind of love is real. The moment the empath integrates these once rejected parts, something irreversible happens. They are no longer manipulatable. They see through guilt. They recognize gaslighting. They feel the subtle shifts in energy when someone's words don't match their intentions. And in that awareness, they stop participating in emotional theater. This is what terrifies the narcissist, not the empath's love, but their clarity. Because the narcissist thrived when the empath was fragmented. They fed off the empath's silence, their softness, their inability to choose themselves. But now, the empath no longer needs to be needed. They no longer chase approval because they have remembered who they are. And who they are is not weak. It is spiritual power, forged in silence, tested in betrayal, and resurrected through truth. As Jung also reminded us, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. The awakened empath chooses not to become bitter, but bold. Not to mirror pain, but to transcend it. They learn to walk away, not with hatred, but with dignity. Healing, for the empath, is not about becoming harder. It's about becoming truer. And truth does not tremble. The empath who reclaims their shadow becomes a force of nature, compassionate but boundaried, open but discerning, soft but not to be mistaken for weak. They hold space without being drained. They listen without losing themselves. They give without being devoured. This is not just emotional intelligence. It is spiritual sovereignty. It is the soul remembering that it was never here to be anyone's supply, savior, or scapegoat. It was here to awaken, to integrate, and to embody the kind of love that cannot be controlled. If you're ready to reclaim your wild self and honor the parts of you that were once silenced, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's rise into wholeness together. 4. Boundaries are not cruel. They are sacred. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel. It makes you conscious. At first, it feels like betrayal, not because you're doing harm, but because those who fed off your silence are finally being denied access to your soul. The empath's awakening isn't loud, but it's seismic. He stops over-explaining, stops fixing what he didn't break, and stops shrinking himself to preserve fake peace. This shift confuses the people who once depended on his compliance because they mistook his kindness for permission and his silence for consent. But peace bought at the expense of truth is a poison that slowly kills the spirit. The moment an empath reclaims his truth, he doesn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone becomes a boundary. He's no longer at war with anyone, but he's also no longer at war with himself. He stops apologizing for his sensitivity and starts seeing it as a compass for his soul. The narcissist doesn't fear the empath's rage. They fear his detachment. They don't fear the argument, they fear being ignored. Because the moment the empath stops needing their validation, the narcissist loses their grip. Narcissists thrive on blurred lines and invisible contracts where the empath keeps giving in exchange for breadcrumbs of affection. But when the empath wakes up, he breaks the contract. He no longer entertains dysfunction. He simply exits the room, the relationship, the role. No anger, no fight, just a sacred removal of energy. And that quiet exit is more powerful than any confrontation. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of your entire being, the conscious, the unconscious, the shadow, and the soul. For the empath, individuation begins with one sacred word: no. No is no longer a wall, it's a form of self-respect. Boundaries are not rejection, they are selection. They're how you choose yourself without needing permission. And when you do, the world rearranges. Some people will fall away, not because you're hard to love, but because you're no longer easy to manipulate. Others will accuse you of changing, of becoming cold, of being selfish. Let them. You are not responsible for their projections. You are responsible for your peace. A man who honors his boundaries becomes a man of depth, discernment, and direction. He stops bleeding for those who refuse to stop stabbing. He stops translating his soul into a language that pleases the broken. He no longer fears being misunderstood, because being at peace with himself means more than being liked by others. And so the empath rises not by force, but by frequency, not by revenge, but by remembrance of who he is. Every boundary he sets is a prayer to his future. Every time he says no to dysfunction, he's saying yes to his healing. Every time he walks away from chaos, he's walking toward clarity. What once felt like loss now feels like liberation. Because when a man chooses his soul over his survival patterns, he becomes dangerous not to others, but to the systems that once fed on his silence. And in that space of quiet power, he is no longer a mirror for others, he becomes a flame. Are you ready to honor your truth and protect your peace? If so, comment below. I choose sacred boundaries to show your commitment to this powerful journey of self-love and transformation. 5. The body reflects the soul's burnout. Years of self-abandonment don't just vanish. They accumulate in the body like silent grief. The soul, tired of being ignored, starts to cry out through physical symptoms. The constant fatigue that no amount of rest can fix. The anxiety that appears without a clear cause. The mysterious illnesses that doctors struggle to explain. These are not random ailments. They are the body's final language when the soul has been silenced too long. Carl Jung taught that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. And in the life of the empath, this resistance often comes in the form of saying yes when every part of them is screaming no. The empath, trained by trauma and conditioned by survival, has lived too long in self-denial, bending to please, to soothe, to avoid conflict. But something begins to shift the moment they awaken to this pattern. A sacred rebellion takes root. They begin to withdraw their energy, to protect their emotional space, and to say no, not out of spite, but out of deep self-honor. And with that shift, healing begins. The chronic symptoms ease, breath deepens, tension melts. The body, once a battlefield, becomes a sanctuary. In today's world, you might see this unfold in a man who's always the reliable one, the emotional container for everyone else's chaos. For years, he's ignored his own exhaustion, brushed off his own pain. But then one day, he stops answering the calls that drain him. He sets limits. He takes time alone. He goes to therapy. And suddenly, the migraines reduce, the sleep returns, and he starts to feel something he hasn't in years: peace. This is not a coincidence. This is soul work. This is what happens when the inner world reclaims its right to exist. And this is what terrifies the narcissist, because the empath, once pliable and guilt-ridden, is now immovable. The old patterns of emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, gaslighting no longer work. The narcissist no longer has power, because the empath is no longer available. This is why the empath's awakening is the narcissist's worst fear. It's the end of control, the collapse of dependency, the rise of spiritual sovereignty. Carl Jung reminds us that the psyche will find expression, whether through dreams, projections, or illness. And when the empath stops repressing their truth, the whole system reorganizes. Boundaries form where guilt once lived. Power returns where exhaustion used to reign. The empath doesn't become cold or cruel, they become clear. They learn that compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. They understand that love without self-respect is not love, it's sacrifice. And so, each act of self-care becomes a ritual of healing. Each no is a vow to the soul. I will no longer abandon you. I will no longer hand over my peace to be accepted by those who never truly saw me. The body listens, and in return, it begins to repair. Muscles relax, breath flows, the immune system restores itself. It's not magic, it's alignment. The message is simple, but revolutionary. Burnout is not just a physical condition. It is a soul wound, a sign that something vital within you has been neglected for too long. The way out is not through pushing harder or numbing the pain, it's through reclaiming your truth. To all empaths who feel weary beyond words, this is your call to remember who you are. You are not here to be drained, to be used, or to play small for the comfort of others. You are here to live from the center of your soul. Let your body speak. Let your soul rise. Let the healing begin. Do you feel the truth in your body's cries? If this message resonates with you, affirm your healing journey in the comments. I honor my body. I reclaim my soul. 6. Authenticity attracts soul-aligned relationships. As the empath begins to reclaim their spiritual sovereignty, a quiet but undeniable revolution takes place within. They no longer see themselves as the fixer, the rescuer, or the emotional caretaker in everyone else's story. Instead, they awaken to the truth that their energy is sacred and their presence is powerful. The narcissist, who once thrived on their confusion and self-doubt, starts to lose their grip not because of confrontation, but because the empath is no longer energetically accessible. They are no longer trying to earn love by overgiving or bending themselves to fit into someone else's broken mold. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And the empath has finally stepped into that privilege with courage and clarity. They no longer confuse adrenaline for love, chaos for passion, or attention for affection. Their nervous system is no longer addicted to emotional turbulence, and that shift alone terrifies those who used to control them through manipulation and emotional high drama. Now, the empath gives from overflow, not from lack. Their love is no longer transactional. It flows from a place of wholeness, not woundedness. And because of that, everything changes. Relationships that were once built on power imbalances begin to collapse, while new connections rooted in soul alignment, emotional safety, and spiritual resonance begin to bloom. These are not relationships formed out of codependency or survival. They are built on mutual respect, truth, and shared growth. The empath begins to attract people who see them not as a resource to be used, but as a soul to be honored. And that shift in energy, that spiritual maturity, becomes a mirror that exposes the hollowness of the narcissist's illusions. The narcissist no longer has access to the empath's attention, emotions, or validation. And that loss of control is what they fear most, not because they loved the empath, but because they depended on their submission to feel powerful. The awakened empath becomes emotionally untouchable, not by building walls, but by standing in truth. Their silence becomes louder than their former explanations. Their peace becomes more powerful than their past apologies. They no longer feel the need to explain their worth or fight for their place. They simply embody it. And in that embodiment, they send a message to the universe. I am no longer available for dynamics that dishonor my soul. The narcissist may try to return, but the frequency has changed, and what once resonated no longer fits. This isn't revenge, it's alignment. It's not bitterness, it's boundaries. The empath doesn't need to prove anything anymore, because they've already remembered who they are. This is the spiritual consequence of healing, a complete redefinition of love, power, and presence. And for the narcissist, who thrives on unawareness, this awakening is terrifying, because once the empath sees the game, they no longer play it. Don't forget to subscribe for more wisdom on how embracing your authenticity leads to soul-aligned, nourishing relationships and the end of draining dynamics. 7. The empath evolves into an oracle and healer. When the empath stops betraying his own soul to maintain peace, something irreversible awakens inside him. Not a version of himself shaped by others' needs, but the emergence of a man who remembers who he truly is. No longer driven by obligation, he steps out of the role of emotional caretaker and into the role of a spiritual sovereign. His worth is no longer tied to how well he can fix, soothe, or save others. Instead, his presence begins to speak louder than words, not because he is trying to prove anything, but because his energy now carries the weight of truth. He evolves from being a sponge absorbing chaos, guilt, shame to a mirror that reflects clarity back into every room he enters. That mirror is terrifying to those who thrive on illusion, especially to the narcissist, who survives by feeding off the confusion and self-doubt of others. But the healed empath is no longer vulnerable to such games. He no longer gives his power away in the name of compassion. His silence becomes sacred, his gaze becomes piercing, and his detachment becomes a boundary sharper than any spoken no. He serves only when it aligns with his spirit, not when it is expected. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that's exactly what's happening here. This is not rebellion, it is soul reclamation. The empath becomes the oracle, not because he predicts the future, but because he has the courage to sit still with what is. He holds space for truth, not chaos. He doesn't absorb the pain of others anymore. He reflects it with such compassion and clarity that it forces them to confront themselves. And this, more than anything, is the narcissist's worst fear. Someone who cannot be manipulated, seduced, or gaslit because they've done the inner work to know who they are. The empath becomes untouchable, not by building walls, but by embodying presence. He stops reacting. He stops explaining. He stops apologizing for his depth. His soul becomes the loudest thing in the room. His energy commands attention, not by force, but by the undeniable resonance of someone who is aligned with their inner truth. He walks away when things no longer honor him. He listens more than he speaks. He chooses peace over drama, solitude over chaos, and clarity over connection at any cost. He doesn't lose love, he redefines it. And in doing so, he becomes the healer, not because he tries to save anyone, but because he finally saves himself. That is spiritual individuation. That is the end of enmeshment and the beginning of empowered being. And once this shift occurs, there is no going back, because the man who chooses his soul over approval becomes the one thing the narcissist cannot control: free. To affirm your evolution into truth and healing, declare your commitment. Comment below. I serve from alignment to honor your journey and inspire others to step into their soul's purpose with clarity and strength. Thank you for joining us today on Spiritual Wisdom. As we've explored, the empath's awakening is not just a quiet transformation. It's a seismic shift that dismantles the illusions narcissists depend on. When the empath stops absorbing the pain of others and starts reflecting truth, their power becomes undeniable. And that is what the narcissist fears most: not anger, not confrontation, but the clarity, sovereignty, and emotional independence of a fully awakened soul. If this message spoke to something deep within you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. Tap the notification bell so you never miss another moment of insight and transformation. Until next time, stay grounded, stay awakened, and remember, your sensitivity is your strength. You don't realize it. Childhood trauma is secretly controlling your life. Carl Jung reveals the truth. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Have you ever felt like something invisible is pulling the strings behind your choices, your emotions, and even your relationships? What if I told you that the root of these struggles might be hidden in a part of you that hasn't healed the child you once were? In today's episode on spiritual wisdom, we're diving into Carl Jung's profound insight on how childhood trauma quietly shapes our lives without us even realizing it. This isn't just psychology, it's a call to awaken spiritually, to reclaim your inner peace, and to finally understand why you react the way you do. If this message resonates with you, leave a comment below. What part of your past do you think is still influencing your present? Let's talk about it. And if you find this video helpful, share it with someone who might need this truth today. Your healing starts here. 1. Childhood trauma silently controls adult behavior. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This powerful truth from Carl Jung speaks directly to every man who has ever asked himself, why do I keep repeating the same mistakes even when I try to change? The answer might not lie in your willpower, logic, or present-day awareness, but in something much deeper, your childhood. You see, spiritual awakening isn't always about transcendence or mystical visions. Sometimes, it's about courageously turning inward and facing what has long been hidden. One of the most profound truths that spiritual wisdom and Carl Jung himself reveals is that the first 7 years of your life hold the blueprint for how you love, trust, fear, and even fail. If those years were marked by neglect, rejection, emotional absence, or shame, then those wounds didn't just vanish as you aged. They went underground. And now, as a grown man, you may not realize that those early traumas are still in control, steering the wheel of your relationships, your self-worth, your emotional reactions, and even your ambition. Let's take a closer look at how this plays out in real life. Maybe you find yourself emotionally shutting down every time your partner gets too close. Or maybe you overwork and chase validation because deep down, you still believe you're not good enough. Maybe you fear being abandoned, not because someone recently hurt you, but because, as a little boy, someone important left you or emotionally withdrew. That pain became a hidden script running silently in the background. Jung believed that what you don't heal, you repeat. That's not just psychology, it's a spiritual law. And until you recognize this pattern and bring it into the light of awareness, it will keep repeating itself, no matter how much success you achieve or how much you want to grow. In today's fast-paced world, men are often taught to man up, suppress emotions, and just keep going. But true strength doesn't come from denial. It comes from awareness, from having the spiritual courage to say, something inside me hurts, and I'm ready to face it. That's where the journey of spiritual awakening begins, not in pretending the past doesn't matter, but in finally giving it the attention it always deserved. When you begin to question the roots of your anger, your fear of intimacy, your emotional numbness, or your need to control everything, you begin the process of reparenting the little boy within you. That's not a weakness. That's transformation. That's what Carl Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole. So I want to ask you this. Are you ready to stop living on autopilot, driven by wounds you don't remember? Are you ready to step into a higher version of yourself, not by running away from the past, but by embracing it? Because this isn't just psychology, it's spiritual wisdom. And if you feel like there's something in your soul that's been silently asking for more peace, more meaning, more truth, then maybe this is your wake-up call. Healing childhood trauma isn't about blaming anyone. It's about taking back your power, rewriting the script, and becoming the man you've always wanted to be. The past may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. And realizing that moment of truth is where your spiritual awakening truly begins. Comment below, I'm spiritually awakened. 2. The inner child still lives within you. Carl Jung once said that the inner child never disappears. It becomes silent but active. This idea holds a profound spiritual wisdom that many overlook in the pursuit of adulthood. If you've ever found yourself overreacting to criticism, shutting down emotionally in moments of vulnerability, or pushing people away, even when you long to connect, you may not be reacting from your adult self at all. You're reacting from the pain of a wounded child within you who never received the safety, love, or acknowledgement they needed. This is not just psychology, it's a journey of spirituality and spiritual growth, because true healing means going beyond behavior to reach the roots of your soul's suffering. Think about the man who can't receive praise without flinching internally, or the woman who constantly sabotages healthy relationships because love feels unfamiliar. These aren't flaws, they're signals. They're signs that somewhere deep within, a part of you is still protecting that child who once felt abandoned, unseen, or unloved. The wound doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. It could be the silent treatment you received as a child, the feeling of never being good enough, or the pressure to be perfect just to earn love. All these small cracks in your early world form the blueprint of how you relate to people, emotions, and yourself. And what's more, your inner child doesn't age out. It lives quietly, influencing your choices, your fears, your dreams. You might be wondering, but I've grown up. I'm strong now. Yes, you've built layers of logic, success, resilience, but underneath, your wounded child might still be steering the ship every time you're triggered. So let me ask you this. When was the last time you paused and truly asked your inner child how they were doing? In today's world, where we're taught to move fast, tough it out, and keep our heads down, this kind of inner listening is rare, but it's also spiritual. Spirituality isn't just about rituals or meditation. It's about wholeness. And wholeness means reintegrating the parts of yourself you've abandoned, especially that inner child who still waits for you to return. In my own life, I once met a man who spent decades achieving outward success, but struggled to connect with his own children. After therapy, he realized that his emotional numbness wasn't a choice. It was a shield built by the boy inside him, who was never hugged, never told, "I'm proud of you." The day he wept for that boy, not with shame, but with compassion, was the day he finally broke the cycle. This is the spiritual wisdom that Carl Jung brought to the world. That our healing lies not in the future, but in going back to collect the lost pieces of ourselves and holding them with love. So ask yourself, what behaviors in your life are actually echoes of childhood pain? What have you dismissed as the way I am that might actually be how I learned to be? And more importantly, are you willing to unlearn them, not just to function better, but to feel whole. Because the truth is, spiritual growth begins not with becoming a new person, but with remembering the old one. The child who felt too much, wanted too much, or was hurt too much. Let that be your turning point. Let that be your awakening. Healing the child within you is not a weakness. It is the most courageous spiritual act you can take. And maybe today is the day you start. Show your determination by commenting below, "I start today." 3. Complexes are formed from emotional wounds. Let's talk about something Carl Jung spent a lifetime exploring: how your past, especially your childhood, might still be running the show behind the scenes. According to Jung, when children go through painful or confusing emotional experiences, whether it's feeling rejected by a parent, being criticized at school, or simply sensing abandonment, even for a short while they absorb this pain without knowing how to process it. He called the emotional residue of these early wounds complexes. And here's the important part. These complexes aren't necessarily born from extreme trauma. Sometimes they form from subtle, almost invisible moments: a raised eyebrow, a disappointed sigh, a parent walking away when we needed them most. These small events build emotional patterns, and over time, these patterns become our reactions, our triggers, our fears, our relationships, and even our beliefs about ourselves. Jung believed that complexes are like islands of pain in the unconscious, fueled by emotional energy that was never resolved. And what makes them so dangerous is that they act without our awareness, pulling strings in the background while we wonder why we keep choosing the wrong partners, sabotaging opportunities, or feeling stuck in the same cycle. As Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Think about that. What if what you call bad luck, failure, or just the way I am is actually a spiritual invitation to uncover an old wound you've never looked at? You see, the power of spiritual wisdom is not in escaping our past, but in illuminating it. Once you realize your emotional reactions have a history, that your fears have a childhood, you stop blaming yourself and you start healing. You start growing. So let me ask you, what patterns in your life feel familiar yet painful? What situations seem to repeat over and over again, despite your best efforts to change? Could those be signs of a complex that's quietly influencing your adult behavior? Carl Jung gave us a language for this inner work, but it's your courage and self-honesty that turns insight into transformation. You don't need to be perfect, just willing to see. Because healing doesn't come from suppressing the past, it comes from facing it with compassion. And if you're on this path of spiritual awakening, know that uncovering these unconscious patterns is not a detour, it is the journey. Keep asking questions, keep paying attention, and most of all, keep showing up for the child inside who never stopped needing your love. Now I invite you to reflect. What emotional response in your daily life might actually belong to your inner child? Let us know in the comments, because sharing your story could be the first step in someone else's healing too. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. 4. The shadow self hides repressed pain. Have you ever felt a sudden wave of anger, sadness, or shame that seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone pressed a hidden button inside you? Carl Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, introduced the concept of the shadow self, a part of your unconscious that stores the emotions, memories, and instincts you were forced to hide or deny as a child. This shadow isn't evil, it's simply unacknowledged. As young boys, many of us were taught that crying was weakness, that anger was dangerous, and that being vulnerable made us less of a man. So we buried those feelings deep down, trying to be strong and acceptable. But here's the spiritual truth. What we repress doesn't disappear. It transforms. It comes back as chronic stress, sudden emotional outbursts, self-sabotaging behaviors, or even mysterious physical pain. And it sneaks into our relationships, making us defensive, distant, or overly controlling without realizing why. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's not just a poetic line, it's a warning. These unresolved wounds silently run your emotional operating system, making decisions for you without your permission. So what does spiritual awakening mean in this context? It's not about escaping your past. It's about courageously turning toward it. It's about facing the shadow and saying, "I see you. I won't abandon you anymore." That act alone begins to dissolve the pain. In modern life, this might mean recognizing how your childhood fear of being abandoned causes you to overwork just to feel worthy, or how your suppressed anger shows up every time someone challenges your authority. You can't fix what you don't face. But when you do face it, with honesty and self-compassion, you begin the sacred work of integrating the shadow. And integration is freedom. It's how the fragmented boy inside you finally grows into a whole man. This journey is not about blaming your parents or your past, but about reclaiming the power that has been locked away by those hidden emotions. If you are someone who feels stuck in the same emotional loop, or is sabotaging the very things you desire most, love, peace, purpose, ask yourself this: what part of me have I been running away from? That question alone can open the door to healing. And through that door, you will find not just your pain, but also your power. Not just your fear, but also your truth. And not just your wounds, but also your spiritual wisdom. This is an invitation to awaken, not to become a new person, but to finally meet the parts of yourself that you have ignored for so long. So take this time to pause and reflect. What might your shadow self be trying to tell you today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 5. Projection reveals unhealed parts of yourself. One of the most powerful concepts Carl Jung introduced was projection, the unconscious act of placing our own hidden emotions, unmet needs, and childhood wounds onto others. He once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And that statement still carries profound spiritual wisdom. Think about it. How often do you find yourself getting disproportionately angry or upset with someone, only to later realize that what triggered you was actually something unresolved within you? In many cases, this isn't just coincidence. It's your inner child reacting to old pain that has never been properly healed. When you were young, if your emotional needs weren't met, perhaps you were ignored, criticized, or made to feel like your feelings didn't matter. Your psyche learned to suppress that pain just to survive. But those wounds don't disappear. They hide in your subconscious and quietly influence your adult life. Then, when someone behaves in a way that even slightly resembles what hurt you before, your nervous system reacts as if that original pain is happening all over again. For example, if you felt abandoned as a child, you might now feel deeply triggered when a partner takes longer than expected to reply to a message. It's not really about the message, it's about the spiritual scars you carry. This is why spirituality and emotional self-awareness are so deeply connected. True spiritual growth requires us to look within and ask ourselves, what am I projecting onto others? What part of me is still aching to be acknowledged, accepted, and healed? Let me share a story from a client I once worked with, a man in his 40s who constantly clashed with his teenage son. Every argument seemed to spiral out of control, and he blamed his son for being disrespectful and stubborn. But when we dug deeper, he realized that the anger he felt wasn't really about his son. It was about his own father, who used to silence him and dismiss his feelings as a child. Without even knowing it, he was projecting his unhealed relationship with his father onto his son, continuing the same emotional cycle. Only when he acknowledged this could he begin to break the pattern. This is the kind of spiritual wisdom that Carl Jung's teachings offer us, not just theory, but practical insight into how to reclaim our power, rewrite our emotional script, and finally begin the spiritual growth we've been unconsciously craving. So I ask you now, who in your life are you projecting onto? Who triggers you the most? And what might that reveal about the wounds you've been carrying in silence? This isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. It's about choosing to stop living on autopilot and start consciously engaging in your healing. Spirituality isn't just about meditation or rituals. It's about having the courage to face yourself and the maturity to own your story. Healing illumination is one of the most sacred steps on the spiritual path because it forces you to move beyond your old identity and meet yourself with honesty and compassion. And remember, healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means becoming aware enough to not let it control you. So if this resonates with you, take a moment today to reflect. What am I still refusing to see in myself that the world keeps showing me through others? Because when you finally understand that, you will not only find peace, you will find your power. Comment below. I choose to escape from my painful past. 6. The persona masks your true self. Let's talk about something that touches far more of your life than you may realize: the mask you wear. According to Carl Jung, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. And it's not just a metaphor. It's a survival mechanism you likely developed during childhood without even knowing it. You see, when we're young, our emotional safety depends on the love and approval of those around us. So when we experience rejection, criticism, or conditional affection, our subconscious adapts. We begin to wear a mask, a persona that wins us approval, attention, or safety. Maybe you became the achiever, the caretaker, the clown, or the quiet one. But here's where it becomes dangerous. Over time, this mask becomes so ingrained that you start to believe it's who you really are. Yet deep down, a quiet ache grows, a spiritual emptiness that whispers, "This isn't me." Have you ever looked at your life and wondered why, despite everything you've done right, you still feel unfulfilled? That's not failure. That's a signal. That's your soul calling you back to your true self. This is where spiritual wisdom becomes essential, not as a lofty idea, but as a guide to reconnect with the parts of yourself you buried just to feel accepted. Think about it. How many of your current habits, roles, or decisions come from the mask you created, not your authentic truth? This is not about blame. It's about awareness. Jung believed that this disconnection from the self leads to chronic dissatisfaction, a kind of inner homelessness. And no amount of success, validation, or applause can fill that void if you're living a life designed to please others rather than express your soul. In today's world, we're praised for having it all together, but rarely are we encouraged to pause and ask, who am I beneath all this? So I ask you, what version of yourself are you still holding on to just to feel loved or worthy? What would it take to remove that mask, even just a little, and allow your true self to breathe again? The journey to healing doesn't start with changing everything on the outside. It begins by remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. As painful as childhood wounds can be, they often carry a hidden doorway to spiritual awakening. And if you're listening to this, that means the door is opening. Let this be your invitation to explore the parts of yourself you've neglected, not to shame them, but to honor them. Because the deeper truth is this: the real you has always been there, waiting patiently beneath the mask. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. 7. Trauma can be inherited and repeated across generations. Have you ever stopped to consider that the pain you carry may not even be yours? Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That statement hits even harder when you realize that trauma can be passed down through generations like a family heirloom, one that no one wants, but few recognize. You may be living out patterns, emotional wounds, and self-sabotaging behaviors that originated not from your own life experiences, but from those of your parents, your grandparents, or even further back. Without spiritual awareness, this unconscious loyalty binds you to your lineage's suffering, as if your soul is trying to finish a story that began long before you were born. In the absence of healing, this inherited trauma continues its cycle, father to son, mother to daughter, until someone finally says, enough. And that someone could be you. That is the call of spiritual awakening, not just to heal yourself, but to cleanse your bloodline, to become the conscious link that refuses to pass the pain forward. In today's world, where masculinity is often associated with stoicism and silence, men are rarely given the space to explore these hidden inheritances. But real strength lies not in suppression, but in transformation. When you begin to see that your anger, your emotional detachment, or your persistent fear of failure might stem from the unspoken grief of your father, or the trauma your grandfather never processed, everything changes. You begin to realize this is not weakness, it is a spiritual responsibility. So I ask you, what unhealed story might you be carrying that is not yours to bear? Are you ready to look beyond your personal wounds and see the deeper layers that have shaped your identity? The journey of individuation, Jung's term for becoming your true self, is not a solo path. It's a sacred rite that liberates not only you, but those who come after you. Breaking generational trauma is not just self-help, it is a profound act of spiritual courage. And as you walk this path, remember, the pain you refuse to confront today will be the burden your children carry tomorrow. But the healing you choose today can become their freedom. What legacy will you leave behind? One of unconscious repetition or one of awakened redemption? This is your moment to choose. 8. Healing requires integration, not avoidance. Most people believe healing means forgetting, suppressing, or simply moving on. But Carl Jung, one of the most influential voices in spiritual psychology, taught something radically different. He said, "Healing is not about forgetting your wounds. It's about integrating them." This is the essence of true spiritual wisdom. Healing requires integration, not avoidance. If you've ever felt like your past is quietly driving your present choices, reactions, or relationships, it's because unhealed wounds don't just disappear. They adapt, they hide, and they whisper through your behaviors. Jung called this the process of individuation, where you courageously face the parts of yourself you've buried, your shadow, your inner child, the rejected and vulnerable aspects of your psyche. And through spiritual growth, not only do you recognize these parts, but you also learn to hold them with compassion instead of shame. It's not an easy path, but it's the one that leads back to your authentic self, the version of you that isn't ruled by pain or fear, but guided by presence and purpose. Let me ask you something. Have you ever reacted in a way that surprised you, like getting overly angry, withdrawing completely, or sabotaging something good, and afterward thought, "Why did I do that?" That's often the voice of an unacknowledged wound making itself known. Take John, a man in his 40s who struggled with emotional intimacy. Every time his partner got too close, he found a reason to create distance. Through therapy rooted in Jungian principles, he uncovered deep abandonment trauma from childhood memories he hadn't thought about in years. Instead of avoiding those memories, he began to confront them, write letters to his younger self, and sit with the emotions that came up. Slowly, he started responding instead of reacting, and for the first time, he experienced love without fear. That's what spiritual healing looks like in real life. Not just feeling better, but becoming more whole. And this is what spirituality teaches us. It's not about being perfect or avoiding pain, but about growing through it, allowing it to shape us into something wiser, softer, and stronger. So I invite you to ask yourself, what part of you are you still avoiding? Which memories still tighten your chest or shape your fears? The work of integration is not about fixing yourself. It's about meeting yourself where you are, with honesty and tenderness. And through that process, your spiritual awakening deepens. You begin to live from awareness, not from survival. You respond to life instead of being hijacked by old scripts. And in doing so, you reclaim your power and reconnect with your truth. The lesson here is clear. Avoidance keeps you stuck, but integration sets you free. And if you're ready to take that journey, start with one small step. Sit with yourself, gently, and listen. Healing isn't a destination. It's a devotion to your own be. And as we close this chapter together, remember, what Carl Jung revealed about childhood trauma isn't just theory. It's a mirror to your inner world, a call to awaken the part of you that has long been buried beneath pain. Today's video explored how unresolved wounds from your past may still be shaping your present, your emotions, your relationships, and your deepest beliefs. But awareness is the beginning of transformation. So I invite you to take this knowledge and turn it into action. Reflect on what part of your inner child needs your love and attention right now. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment in this video struck a chord with you? What truth are you now ready to face? At Spiritual Wisdom, we honor your courage and your voice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you never miss a step on this sacred journey of healing. Your story matters, your healing matters, and you are not alone.